Commas are the most familiar markers of a pause, but also the most confusing, because you can use them in so many different ways. And you also shouldn't use them in so many different ways. I've started this comma drama series for grammar's sake, to make you familiar with the proper uses of a comma, so you won't feel so uncomfortable when questioning if one should be placed on a page. I can think of no better place to start with commas than with the most impactful type. I call it the comma fanboys combo. It's the one where the comma makes the greatest impact, merging two sentences into one. But it can't be done alone. It needs a conjunction to get the job done. With the comma fanboys combo, a comma marks the separation of two sentences in one. The grammatical name for those sentences, since each doesn't have its own period, is independent clauses. To get a complete sentence or a clause that can stand on its own, you need a subject and a verb, basically who is doing what. It gets more complicated than that with states of being and be verbs, but we'll just try to get by on this. If you have two complete who doing what combos with only one period at the end, you should be looking for a place for your comma. The spot should go right in the middle of the two sentences or clauses. In this case, who is doing what? I am writing. And then who is doing what? Jan is editing. So those can be split by a comma and something else. As a side note, it's not always a who, sometimes it's a what. So it's more of a what does what scenario. What is doing what in this sentence? The car is racing. And then what is doing what? A truck is blocking. So you have the two pairs. You're going to need a comma to split it. But a comma can't stand on its own to merge two sentences into one. It needs a conjunction. If you have two complete sentences, or independent clauses, going before one period, yes, you need a comma, and it will go right before the conjunction. So why this visual aid? Because fanboys is the abbreviation for the common conjunctions. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Remember that acronym. Pick the appropriate fanboy and put it in place. Now we established that formula for two sentences or independent clauses in one. You have your subject action, then you got to add your comma in between, and you pick from among the fanboys. For this sentence, it seems that and might go well. The car raced and the truck blocked. In another subject action. In this scenario, and or but would be a good one, depending on what you want to do. We talked about seeking out your sentences first, or your subject-verb pairs, but you could also scan for fanboys first. So let's try that here. Let's find all the fanboys in these sentences and underline them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to need a comma in front of them, because that will depend on whether there's a subject-verb agreement in front of them. So we have and, or, but, yet, but. Those are our fanboys. Let's see if we need commas. So in the first scenario, who does what? I work out. But on the other half of the sentence, who does what? Well, there's a doing, running, but there's not a who. That's in the first half. So no comma there. Who does what? Megan likes. Who does what? Well, we have a what, we don't have a doing, so we don't have an action or a subject in the second half of that sentence. No comma. Who does what? Jeremy eats. But there's no who or do in the second half of that sentence. So again, no comma. I'd ride with Seth. Who does what? I ride. And then the second half, who does what? Jack likes. Oh, good. We can put a comma. So there's our comma fanboys combo. Who does what? He gets hold of. Who does what? Well, there's planning going on, but by who is in the first half of the sentence, not the second. So we're just going to have to leave the comma off that one. And then Casey likes, but we don't have any action or subject in the second half of the sentence. So again, no comma. So remember, when you're doing the comma fanboy combo, you have two steps. You need to find separate subject-verb pairs within the sentence. And you need to find a fanboy, or a place where a fanboy is needed. If you don't have both those, you don't need a comma. I don't feel like I'd be doing you a very good service if I didn't take you through a few tricky examples. In the first two cases here, it looks like you have a complete subject-verb pair in both halves of the sentence. If you cover up that first word, Jeff sings, everybody stops. Grindel brings, Max makes. So it looks like it's a great candidate for the comma fanboy combo. However, you have to pay attention to that first word. In those first words, well, if you just look at that first half of the sentence without the rest, when Jeff sings solo, you're left hanging. Well, what happens when Jeff sings solo? So actually, you're going to need the comma there, but no fanboy. That's another scenario that we'll get into in a later instructional. After Grindel brought the presents, what happened? Even if you add a fanboy after Grindel brought the presents and Max made the cake, you're still left hanging, so the fanboy doesn't help the situation. The comma does, but the fanboy does not. These are conditional words. They do an introductory phrase, and if you switch the sentence around, Max made the cake after Grindel brought the presents, you don't need the comma. But with it being the introduction before the subject happens, that comma is needed there. Now let's look at the third example. Taking his temperature. We don't have a who. So this isn't like the others. But it is kind of similar, because when you look at that word, it may work at the end of the sentence where you don't need the comma. Minnie learned Mickey would be staying home by taking his temperature. However, since it's at the beginning, before the subject, it needs a comma. Again, we'll get more into that later. Those are different cases where you need commas but not fanboys. I put together a chart of power rankings for punctuation to drive home the fact that the comma can't stand alone in the subject-verb pair scenario without a fanboy to help make connections. So among the sentence stoppers, commas don't show up. There's the exclamation point, which I put at the top of the list because it's either excitement or anger, but it's always something passionate and strong. The question mark, you may be wondering, why is that above the period? Well, because exclamation marks and question marks are usually the end of a sentence, but a period is often an abbreviation or something else, so it's questionable as to whether that's really the end of the sentence. You just have to look for capitalization next, and sometimes if that's a proper noun, it's still not the end of the sentence. Sentence joiners, though, there are only two. This semicolon is the strongest. It doesn't need any help, but the comma, as you've learned, needs an assistant if it's going to join two sentences. Any of the fanboys will do, as long as they make sense for the situation. Sentence slowers, comma is among that list, and that may explain why commas can be so confusing, because they're so multi-purpose. It tops that list, though. That's because it's the Swiss Army knife of sentence slowers. If you want to slow a sentence, usually you'll be okay sticking a comma there, but there's good reason to choose some of the other punctuation choices at other times, and we'll talk more about those later on for grammar's sake. So one more time with the examples. Now, we've been talking about subject action, the comma fanboys combo, but now you know you could have subject action, and a semicolon by itself in between. So let's look at these. We have Gary called, I refused. You got subject action, but a comma by itself won't do. You either need comma fanboy or a semicolon. Gary called and I refused to pick up the phone. Mr. Max is grateful. Max is actually our verb there. Shane does well. So we need a comma fanboy. And I bet but Shane will do well might work, and is probably a stronger choice. The last one is tricky. I would have gone to the mountains if I hadn't heard Ethan was injured. I gone, or would have, if I hadn't heard Ethan was injured. Ethan injured. So it seems like you have two, but can you stick a fanboy in there? I would have gone to the mountains and if I hadn't heard Ethan was injured. Well, now it seems like the sentence is hanging. We're left hanging. It needs something, and that's because that if word is one of those conditional words. It adds conditions to the situation. In fact, the comma isn't needed there because this comes after the subject of the sentence. I would have gone to the mountains is enough for the subject. If I hadn't heard Ethan was injured, wouldn't work by itself. So if you stuck that at the front of the sentence, afterward it would need a comma, but there it doesn't. Another confusing comma situation, but it just shows you don't need a fanboy. Go ahead and try to plug it in just to see. If you practice hunting down subject-action pairs and seeing fanboys as groupies often hanging around sentences of this kind, you'll quickly get the hang of when you need a comma-fanboy combo in your writing. I'm Camille Turner on What's Right. For grammar's sake, next time we'll look into how commas help you make the grand subject introductions in sentences, those introductory clauses I just brought up to you as tricky scenarios, so you can come closer to mastery of the comma drama.